Okay, so I'm working on the lighting. That's a little better. Come out here. Okay, a little better. Well, so all right, I'll just start. Good morning, and just wanted to mention I discovered something recently. I started using Blue Sky, which is like the alternative to Twitter, and somebody mentioned the Minnesota Miracle, and I was reminded of a report I noticed my dad had been part of for the Citizens League, which is just a volunteer civic organization, and it was called the Minnesota Miracle. It turned out my dad had chaired the report, and and my mom had mentioned it, so I asked my mom about it, and she said it got my dad kind of in trouble because basically the Citizens League issued this report saying that the funding for education in Minnesota should be based on the a progressive income tax estate increase that's progressive instead of local property taxes, because the problem of the obvious problem is that if you rely on local property taxes for education, then poor poor poorer neighborhoods have bad education because they can't afford the resources and everything, obviously. So okay, it seems pretty, it's pretty clear cut, but my dad was Republican, and so you know I mean, you look at politically the stance of the Republican Party now. They obviously they're against progressive taxation, and sure enough, my dad had been the chief deputy officer of the attorney general, and so the report was issued. I think the same year I was born. It was 71. I got it on my blog, so I posted the link. Um, yeah, I think it was anyway. Okay, so yeah, so the Democratic here I'll post in the usually, don't get into politics like in big details, but so I didn't know this. My mom had mentioned it caused my dad trouble because essentially the attorney general that had appointed my dad to be chief deputy officer then ran for governor as the Republican candidate for Minnesota, and he was against this Minnesota Miracle plan. And and so the problem is that my dad had chaired the report that issued the plan, and so then the Democratic candidate was for the plan, and so they had a big debate about the plan, and so it put my dad in an awkward position because as a Republican, he had chaired a report that the Democratic governor candidate was supporting, and then the Democratic candidate won the election for governor, and the Republican candidate lost, who had appointed my dad. Um, but the thing is, this when my dad had been appointed, he was only allowed to serve for 2 years because his law firm, only let him go for 2 years, and then they wanted him back to be in the law firm. And of course, I was just being born at the time. He was appointed before I was born, and then he issued this report right when I was being born. And let's see. Okay, the report was issued in 1970. So September 1970, um, well, I was conceived. Had been conceived. My mom was pregnant with me. Okay, so anyway, yeah, so that got me thinking about, the Minnesota Miracle being Qigong master Chunyi Lin he is literally a Minnesota miracle because he's, doing miracle healing, and he's got a healing center, and he works with the Mayo Clinic doctors. And so when I talked to my dad about Qigong, he's just like, well, that's not the culture we have here, you know? And yeah, he was correct. I mean, we do not have a culture based on meditation, but Chinilin, he calls Minnesota the Tibet of the U.S., and Tibet is in in s- you know in regards to China, Tibet's considered like the where you do real serious meditation. And I mean, it's also really cold, so it's like Minnesota's like Tibet. Also, there's a Tibetan community. Like, I think it's the second biggest in the United States is in Minnesota. And so there's a Tibetan monastery that Qigong Master Chunyi Lin, he does a yearly mantra meditation session with the Tibetan monks, and he used to take them on a cruise ship every year. He would take them, on a vacation essentially, but they would do this free mantra meditation on the cruise ship, which I thought was pretty funny because Chunyi Lin was claiming that, I mean, it's easier to heal the ocean when you're on the cruise ship or something, and I'm just thinking, yeah, well, cruise ships also really pollute the oceans, and so. But anyway, um, yeah. So these are the ironies of being a qigong master in modern industrial civilization, where you have lots of pollution. And of course, that was an issue my dad worked on. Also, he had a disagreement with the attorney general when my dad went back into private practice, and the attorney general, they clashed about. That was another thing that my mom mentioned, where the governor had said something about a case that my dad was working on that was not accurate in my dad's, you know, view about pollution in Lake Superior that my dad was working on, with the company that was polluting. And my dad was telling them to follow the EPA regulations, And and then I actually got together. I was well, my dad's former law partners still, get together with my mom, and they were part of the one of them worked in the attorney general's office, but he worked there after my dad had left. And but the thing is my dad did write the procedural manner for the manual for the attorney general's office, and when my dad had become chief deputy officer, so he managed the office, and um, he was he made a big change because he wrote this procedural manual, and you know, I was talking to this other lawyer who worked at the office, and basically they, the the claim was, well, the attorney general office should have the best lawyers in Minnesota. The state attorney general office, needs to have the best lawyers. And so that was sort of what my dad set that up, because my dad felt the same way, that the when he came in there, the office was kind of not up to standards. So let's see if I got any water here. So basically, it's like, well, in terms of the culture, the way I was raised was the law comes first, and you respect the law. I mean, this my dad never told me this, but it's just like I knew that was his career and people respected him. And so um the problem is that I I kind of became a hermit when I was growing up, and I would go fishing every day. And then when I was 12 years old, this movie was shown on TV at night called The Day After, and it was about um, nuclear war and what would happen to humans trying to survive. And it really, it scared me, because that was the whole point of the movie, was to scare people to realize that this could really happen at any moment. And after that, I just kind of lost all like trust in civilization at that point. And I told my dad I couldn't respect him, because I was into nature. I was fishing every day. I thought, if you have to live aligned with nature, um or else we're going to be doomed. We're going to destroy ourselves along with nature. And I didn't, I was 12 years old, so I was just like a kid going through puberty. But, that upset my dad, but I didn't realize at the time how much it had set him, because my mom told me later on. But, I still meant what I said. And the thing is that, I mean, he stayed Republican, and it's like the Republican Party just got more corporate, what they call corporate libertarian, which is basically fascism. They call it corporate libertarian, but it's really fascism. And with the Reagan Revolution, and when the Reagan Revolution happened, even my dad complained to me, or he wrote it in his journal. I found his journal later, but he said that, his rates had gone so high up per hour. I think it was like $200 an hour in the 1980s, and he realized that, at that point, like, the normal citizen would not be able to afford him at all. And he was basically a, corporate lawyer at that point. Later on, he did end up working for the same former attorney general who he had been appointed to, who had run for governor. He left his original firm, and he joined that other person's firm, and became the second name in the firm's name. Um, and I guess that upset some of the other lawyers in the firm. I don't even know if the firm's still around or not, but because everybody, I know that the first person is no longer alive, and my dad, of course, no longer alive. But anyway, yeah, so they kept. But I'm assuming his rates went down at that point, because it was a small firm. But what basically I realized studying the issues that law firms in the US, they kind of they got big. They started out as boutique, what they call boutique firms, which is you do not advertise, um you just kind of have a respectable business as a lawyer. And but now, of course, there's attorneys advertise all the time to get try to get business, and they have these big like conglomerate firms. And of course, I mean, there's a lot of corruption, obviously. Um, and so anyway, the Minnesota Miracle, um, I think it's still going on. I mean, Minnesota is known to be considered to be progressive, but the problem is that if you look at the corporations, whether it's Cargill's the world's largest corporation based out of Minnesota. So this whole big thing with farmers not being able to sell their crops to China because of tariffs. What people don't realize is that Cargill is still like they say, well, China's buying from Brazil. Well, yeah, they're buying from Brazil through Cargill. Cargill is based in Minnesota, so you have this global imperial structure out of Minnesota. And my dad did some work for Cargill, and I found his index list of business contacts when after his he passed on, and he had told me he had done some work for Cargill. He also worked for Northwest Airlines, which is now Delta, and he had the DB Cooper case, which I pointed out before. That was his most famous case, he said. And I didn't know whether to believe him or not, but I found it online. I found him listed as, for the DB Cooper case. But he just covered the insurance, whether they would get their Northwest would get their insurance from the kidnapping or the hijacking. And but usually, like, it's just like corporate law, it's civil litigation, so it wasn't. I think he said he put one person to prison. He didn't tell me the details, but so yeah. But the real Minnesota Miracle is the Qigong master Chunyi, but my dad also was part of this Minnesota Miracle. It was well documented now. And um the other thing my dad did was something I haven't talked about before, but he helped out his siblings a lot. And because my dad was making good money, and my mom told me this later because I never knew this growing up, but he was helping out his siblings financially to help them get established. And then that included, helping out with schooling costs. And so I had a cousin the same age as me, and he went into business, and then he founded a commercial real estate company from his based on his business degree. And so my dad also had started up a small real estate company also. And they were both called Hempel Properties. Well, now, my dad's company no longer exists. It was just owned a few apartments, but and maybe a house or two. And it was just like we would go, my family would clean the houses. It wasn't like it was just little family, like basically like a tax shelter or something. But for yeah, my cousin's business became a multi-billion-dollar commercial real estate firm, and it's still around. You see the name, my dad's last name. So in his final years, my dad s- really was proud of my cousin, who's the same age as me, and then um yeah, and then my cousin ended up passing on soon after my dad, just a few years later after my dad, like 4 or 5 years later. So they're both gone, but my cousins, they kept the business name in my cousin's name, and my dad had supported my cousin a lot. So he, he even at one point he's like, "Well, you can go get a job with um my cousin." He said that to me, and which is funny because I mean, like I first of all, I wasn't really qualified to do what, but with the Qigong training, at that, I'm not really qualified to be in a normal job. Um, and then of course my cousin ended up um getting brain cancer and passing on, and I personally think he got it from cell phones, I think, personally, because he's probably on the cell phones all the time, and I could feel the microwaves from the cell phones, from my Qigong training. Um, and so I always tell people to keep your cell phones on speaker and to keep them away from your skull, because it's well proven the microwaves cook your skull, the water. And so anyway, that was my dad's legacy that's now still around with my cousins. They gave him a big op-ed in the corporate newspaper for Minnesota, and I don't know, it was about 10 years ago now. And so yeah, his company is still well established, like a multi-billion dollar commercial real estate company. And Um, he's got he left his, son. He has sons that are grown up now. I've never met him or anything, so but, yeah, so that's the Minnesota Miracle in terms of my dad's, legacy and my family's name, but I look more towards my grandfather who was a minister, and sort of the roots of my dad's upbringing was through my grandfather being a minister, and then my dad being the oldest son, so there's kind of that legacy there. His sister was older than him, but not much older. And and then you just look at how, like, my dad was born on a kitchen table in northern Minnesota in a house that didn't have any modern facilities. I think that probably had like an outhouse and like coal for heat, and I don't know if they had electricity or not because it was the 1930s. And so, I mean, you just think of like the huge transformation through my dad's life of civilization. Modern industrial civilization really is only like basically 100 years old, essentially. Go back to 1920, and um, a lot of people didn't have electricity or plumbing. Um, yeah, so it's kind of fascinating, but the Minnesota Miracle is really about this qigong, in my opinion, and what is the legacy of the qigong for humanity. Um, I think even the qigong master Chunyi, he talks about quantum physics, and he said, you will study quantum physics to try to explain qigong, and that's what I've done for the past 25 years. And um I think that I have solved that mystery, well, not just me personally, but I've, investigated other people who have solved it, and I've pieced it together where they didn't they didn't know about each other. I'm talking about the non-commutative researchers and the scientists. So it's Eddie Oceans and Basil J. Hiley, and they didn't know about each other. So I mean, it's just a handful of people, and of course, it also explains why our our culture as the West is destroying life on Earth. Is what they call biological annihilation in ecology. And again, that's by the time I was 12 years old. This is how I felt. I was, told my dad I could not respect him because the just the way that Western civilization was destroying nature. I mean, I was going out fishing every day. I even went to camp fish when I was 14 years old, and I didn't I did not really meet anybody there. I just was fishing, I was into the fishing, and, um, I had fun, but I didn't, like, make any friends or anything because everybody was focused on fishing, and, um, when I was when I was around the same time, probably a little younger, I went to another, like, a Bible camp, and I just looked for four-leaf clovers the whole time because I was really into four-leaf clovers at the time, and I put them in my Bible, and I collected, I don't know, maybe a dozen four-leaf clovers, and then somebody stole them out of my Bible or something. I can't suddenly they were gone out of my Bible, so that was, like, maybe somebody was against the four-leaf clovers, like, they thought they were, but I'm just trying to say, like, I was definitely, like, already, like, a hermit focused on nature at a young by the time I was 12 years old, and, um, and then when I got into music more, I was interested in how that was connected to nature, and that eventually got me into meditation and then into non-commutativity. Well, happy equinox. There's still some equinox energy going on.